And liberalism foreclosed on that liberty by essentially saying there is no objective order. Even if there was, we couldn't know it. And because we couldn't know it, all there is our own projections. And then liberalism, because it says that all that there really is assertion, it then follows that it goes with the most powerful assertion. And so liberalism ultimately becomes a philosophy of power and a philosophy of the absolute.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and Marlo.
Today we're recording with Phillip Blond, who joined us in DC this past weekend at the American Economic Forum, where he gave an excellent keynote lecture on Red Toryism for America. Phillip is the founder and director of ResPublica, an independent policy think tank based in the UK. He's also the author of Red Tory. We're excited to have you with us again, Phillip.
Delighted to be here.
Before we get to the interview, we'd like to thank you all for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Phillip, it's probably fair to say that you were the original post-liberal. You were post-liberal before it became cool, at least over here in the United States. And at the ISI conference this past weekend, you mounted a pretty robust critique of liberalism, both as a philosophy and sort of how the public policy implications end up creating this insecurity, economic, political, and cultural. So I'm wondering if you could do two things. One, talk to us about the failures of liberalism generally as a philosophy. But then if you could speak to, you're also a champion of liberality and believe that some form of liberality can exist within a non-liberal or a post-liberal regime. So maybe if you could explain some of the non-liberal sources of liberality, that would be helpful.
Certainly. Look, I'll begin with the second question first, if I may. So I'm non-liberal in the sense that I think there are objective goods out there in the world that we human beings can know, can discern, and can inculcate. And I think that the task of modern or contemporary politics is to align itself with reality and to recognize that reality or materiality is made up of essentially values that have to be shared and communicated in order that all human beings can flourish. So what that means is that we're in commerce with an objective order, but we're not equal to it. In contradistinction to modernity, or think Kant, it isn't the case that, to quote a line from Opus Posthumus, it isn't the case that there is something outside of me as a result of my activity. It isn't the case that I impose on a meaningless world meaning. It isn't the case that ontologically the world is arbitrary and that only my projected epistemology brings order and form to objects. On the contrary, we are in commerce with the real, and the real, I think, in part, tells us how we should react to it. Now, what this means is, because I'm a theologian and a philosopher, I think we're in commerce with things that exceed us. And yet we know them by participation, which is how Plato put it. And that means that you know something of the objective, but you don't know all of the objective. And it's precisely because you can't claim adequation between your mind and objective truth that one, in that sense, must be a liberal. You can't foreclose upon an object that when you don't know that object in its entirety. And if you think about the world, and if you think that if I asked you to give a description of a glass on a table in front of you, a full description of that glass is impossible, absolutely impossible, because you would have to give a description that related to every other object in the cosmos at every single stage. And that is beyond our ken, not least because, as Heraclitus has put it, you can't put your foot in the same river twice. So So what I'm trying to suggest is just because you're a realist or you think you can know the natural law, it doesn't mean your mind is equal to that law, and you can't find adequation within it. And that, I think, is a properly Catholic position, if I can put it like that. Whereas a Protestant position on the extreme wing actually thinks that you can know the absolute and foreclose on the absolute in an odd and paradoxical way, whereas a properly understood Catholic thinking never thinks it can. And that's why Christian philosophy has always been about the mediation of the objective. And because it's mediated, that creates the possibility of other perspectives, other takes. It allows the possibility of discernment, and it creates the possibility of freedom and of being and of liberality, if one can put it like this. Essentially, the Christian description of the world forbids you from being an absolutist, and that is part of the condition of human freedom. And that is why I think human freedom or liberalism liberty precedes liberalism. And liberalism foreclosed on that liberty by essentially saying there is no objective order. Even if there was, we couldn't know it. And because we couldn't know it, all there is our own projections. And then liberalism, because it says that all that there really is assertion, it then follows that it goes with the most powerful assertion. And so liberalism ultimately becomes a philosophy of power and a philosophy of the absolute. So to answer your second question first, it's liberalism that creates absolutism, where it's kind of the pre-liberal positions that I view myself within the Platonic and the Christian tradition, creates the possibility of human freedom because it doesn't think absolutes are possible within human knowledge. So that takes us, I think, to your first question, which is how did we end up being governed by this extreme form of liberalism? And really, we ended up being governed by this because liberalism managed to wipe out the doctrine of ontology. It managed to wipe out the idea that there was something other than human will. And if you look in the social contract theorists, who are the foundation of modern liberalism, they only valorize human will. And in that valorization of human will, they create the absolutes I've talked about. Think of Hobbes's Leviathan, think of Rousseau's general will. And now what liberalism has done, because ultimately it's Nietzschean, it's a philosophy of power and an endorsement of power, is it monopolizes power, wealth, and opportunity. And in its extreme form, and all liberalism is in its extreme form, is liberalism unlimited by any non-liberal ideology. So classical liberalism, as people desperately try to tell you, is unlike modern libertarianism. Well, it's only unlike modern libertarianism because it's constrained by something that isn't liberal. If there is no constraint, classical liberalism becomes libertarianism of the most extreme sort, and there's no logical bulwark to stop that descent. And liberalism, as I recast it, is essentially a philosophy of power, does what all philosophy of powers do, which is accrue assets, opportunity, wealth, etc., to the most powerful. And that is indeed what's happened. On the watch of liberalism, if we can put it in class terms, which remain, I think, perilously close to the truth of developed Western economies, what the ascent of liberalism has done is to strip in the 20th and 21st century the working classes of power, agency, opportunity, assets, and any form of security. What modern liberalism means is destroying a working class person's ability to make a living, to secure for themselves a family. Both parents have to work, and that still isn't enough to prevent poverty or insecurity. Modern liberalism, because it operates against the collectivity of workers and indeed humanity, atomizes working class people, gives them the lowest possible level of wage in order that the money and the flow can accrue at the top. socially, it's most important for liberalism to shatter the social compact and render the world so individuated that nobody can think or imagine there might be any common interest between us. So they all haplessly mouth their own individual goals, whilst the possibility of realizing those goals recedes ever more and at an ever greater rate. And politically, what liberalism does is it eats away all the other ideologies. So I think, with the possible exception of Christopher Lasch, I was the first to argue that social liberalism and economic liberalism are the same. And in Red Tory, I said that it's always social liberalism that comes first, because you have to destroy the collective shared social compacts of an institution or a culture in order for economic liberalism to then run free. And that's certainly what happened in the 1960s. So it's the left that went neoliberal first. It's the left that is extremely socially neoliberal, and that's that creates the conditions for economic neoliberalism. And as I said, it creates social insecurity, where people are isolated individuals on their own without recourse or requirement in respect of anyone else. Politically, it ensures its own ascendancy, and economically, it reduces those at the bottom of the income scale to a type of serfdom that they cannot change or cannot overcome. So the lesson of liberalism isn't the Corn Laws in Britain in the 19th century. It's not about bringing cheap corn so people can eat. It's about owning all the corn and charging so much for it that they can't eat. And modern liberalism is now synonymous with mass insecurity. And I haven't even talked about cultural insecurity, or the way that the children of the bourgeoisie use language to further persecute people who use language differently further down the class scale and assure their own ascendancy. But I'm sure we'll get into that. So hopefully that's enough of an answer, Johnny, to both questions.
So could you talk about what a post-liberal regime informed by Christianity would look like in a contemporary context, especially with you highlighted the lack of power and agency and security that populations face under liberalism today? What would that look like informed by Christian ethics and traditions?
Okay, so it would look like a world of common and shared concern and debate. So in our current world, there's only one power, and that's the absolute state, the untrammeled market, both of which support one another. Because if you have anarchy in one area, you have to have absolutism in another. And what you have is a world where you have individuals without agency, and the only agency are with kind of anarchic capital and an absolutist state. What I've long believed in is a corporatism of all the bodies, if I can put it like that. Power is really through intermediate or mediate associations. It's only through people gathering together to express their common interest that they can ensure that common interest, A, exists and B, is catered to. So what it would look like in reality is a world where freedom is much more diffused through those intermediate bodies instead of direct appeal up to the state, which always rules in the name of that which is ascendant. So that's its kind of state structure. Its cultural structure would be something where it insisted on the liberation that goes with norms. So we live in a culture now where minorities have power over majorities, and majorities are forced to combine with minorities, no matter how extreme the view. And this becomes pernicious because at the same time, we're denied any possibility of friendship or solidarity or ways to cross racial, class, sexual barriers. So that what we do on the one hand is we desegregate the common good, isolate it into either kind of racial essentialism, sexual essentialism, except, of course, at the same time, they argue there's nothing essential about sex. So they've never kind of quite worked that out. And then they try to essentially destroy the possibility for people to come together and name norms. And norms don't just serve the powerful. Norms are the only thing that hold the powerful to account. And if you're in a world of corporate bodies, if we can put it like that, the norms that you engender will constrain both the absolute state and the anarchic market and empower individuals. So what I want is a world of common decency that also creates an economics where we price in the externalities that poverty produces and the state picks up, where we create an economics where all can flourish. And the fundamental aim of this Christian state, if you would call it that, is to believe in a shared morality where we hold things in common and we try to discern the good because we think the good is possible to discern. And we try to distribute the benefits of that good to all members of the body politic. So I hope that was kind of broad enough. I'm happy to go into granular detail if you would like.
Philip, I'm wondering, I have another two-part question for you. In your talk, you were speaking about red Toryism for America in particular. And so maybe if we could approach that from two angles, one philosophical, the other public policy. You know, America has a written constitution, Britain has an unwritten one. Many post-liberals argue that America's founding was liberal in nature, and I think that's true to a degree, but not entirely. So I'm curious how post-liberal political philosophy maps onto the American regime, or does it not? And then secondly, I'm wondering if you could do what you did so well in the last panel of our conference, which is unpack several of your very practical post-liberal policy proposals for recapitalizing the poor and strengthening families.
Certainly. Well, I always favor an unwritten constitution over a written constitution because a written constitution and unwritten constitutions are stronger and they're more open to the different aspects of the polity that are existent. They're both more flexible and break less. And what I think is interesting about the American situation is that it was crafted as a democratic refutation of monarchy. But what you produced in America is a monarch without power and a system that can't deliver. So actually, the monarchical position is one of the great commonalities of the human experience. Whether you elect a monarch or it's a duty that's conferred through the family line, there is no human organization that was without ultimate authority. But in America, what you've produced is a system that ensures democracy can't work and can't deliver. So you have democracy, if you look back at the Chartists or you look back at the ideology that was around it, was meant to challenge absolute power and distribute the goods of that polity to all members of that polity. And I think by any measure, democracy has failed that. And the worrying thing is, if you look at a country like China, that I think is our enemy, it has used totalitarian means to the ends that democracy has claimed for itself. And democracy doesn't protect minority rights. It doesn't do anything that people have told of it without being aligned to the fundamental values and virtues that I talked about. And the thing is I don't agree with those who claim America's always been liberal and has a liberal founding. That's not what I see in de Tocqueville. What I see in de Tocqueville is the production of a liberal outcome from shared values. Every page of Democracy in America is an elucidation of tacit and unspoken shared values that everybody practices. And because they're shared values, they don't need to be expressed, but it produces liberal outcomes. And that's really what I'm arguing for. What you have or had in America was a shared notion, a thick version of life, which then produced how do we live life together and still enjoy this thick version of life or this pattern of norms. The trouble is in America, and you're the most polarized society in the democratic world, in the democratic developed world, is that when you don't have those shared versions of life, it all breaks down, and that's what's breaking down. And so the interesting thing, I think, about America is really not kind of endless sort of assertions about what, Franklin thought or Washington did, or the Federalist Papers or whatever. It's really about what is the thick version of life out of which Americans were able to produce a relatively liberal state, because they didn't produce a relatively liberal state out of liberal values. They produced a relatively liberal state over forms of life that I think the only person who's truly articulated it well was the French aristocrat, rather than contemporary theorists. So I think sort of mapped onto the Constitution, it would look a lot more like states' rights in one way, but not recasting the state as the new absolute government. It would have to look like the associative state that America originally envisaged itself to be. It would have to look like a community of communities that interpenetrated one another in order to shape a world where everybody could live without violence. And obviously we're not there. And the reason we're not there is I think that liberalism has eaten away that form of life and has voided it. And now all you have is an empty formalism filled of competing and contesting wills. So that would be my sense. And until you can recover that thick form of life, you're not going to recover the Constitution that you hoped for. So, to your second question, which is how do we help restore that form of life? Well, a couple of ideas, say on the cultural front. So the cultural front is overwhelmingly captured by left liberals who use extreme individuation to separate and create antagonistic racial groups. But if you look at all the people who are hired by these companies, the people they don't hire are working class people. So I think to the language of diversity, what has to be introduced is the notion of socioeconomic diversity. And socioeconomic diversity as being the heaviest penalty in America, which it still is, and in a way it's melded with race. And I think if you introduce the idea of socioeconomic diversity into the requirements that currently exist for other forms of diversity, you would change the American world. Because in my experience, middle-class people in these kind of woke companies feel very comfortable with people of a similar class, regardless of sexual orientation or color. But they're profoundly uncomfortable with working-class people. And they certainly try to exclude them at all points and all junctures. In terms of economic security, there's lots to be done. I think I've said this in numerous points, but for developed economies where we are not trading internationally with the products of low-skilled labor, there is no economic downside to the minimum wage at all. And it's often the easiest way to dramatically improve the lives of the poor. We've done it in Britain, and it had no import or impact other than raising the living standards and the security of the working poor. And it would only impact if we were in competition with people making us soup or sandwiches. And guess what? Even the Chinese aren't doing that. Secondly, that what we've got to look at are things like the tax advantages that accrue to those who have capital versus those who don't have capital. In America, there's a whole host of tax advantages where you're taxed at a lower rate than income if you dispose of capital. But the overwhelming majority of people go through their entire life and never dispose of any capital and never make any claim on for capital allowances. I think there should be an ability for the poor to trade their capital allowances with the rich, engendering capital return and assets for themselves and an additional return for the state, and a slightly lesser return than they otherwise would for the wealthy. We've got to dramatically increase the asset ownership of the bottom half of the population, or else they become dependent on the state, and then welfare itself rises and contributes to a decline in productivity. So I think it makes good, empowering conservative arguments against kind of liberal capture of all assets. In addition, what we've got to do is hypothecate the vast wealth that accrues on certain inheritance taxes to inheritance for the poor. The most successful saving schemes in the United Kingdom that was ever done was matching savings for the poor, where the state matched savings, and they're only like £400 or £500 a year, up to a level like that for poor children. That transforms the lives of those children so that when they reach maturity, they have asset enough to go to college or to start a business. I see no reason why we can't hypothecate beyond a certain level taxes from the very wealthy to endow those who have nothing and are likely to never have anything at all. Finally, mutualism and a stake in companies. If you believe in stakeholder capitalism, if you want lots of people to own, we simply have to find a way of endowing everybody with assets and ownership. And part of that is creating advantages for mutualism. And we know mutual companies perform better on any number of indices than other companies. So there's a few selection of ideas for how we can transform the world in which we live, all of which I think will dramatically enhance the lives of those at the bottom.
So, during your speech at a conference this past week, you actually had a critique of national conservatism and nationalism, and of course, a lot of these policy prescriptions would probably be enacted on that basis. But you're also previously talking about shared versions of life and instilling this sense of communities within populations, which I'm curious to see, like, what would you say? Well, first of all, if you could maybe flesh out that criticism that you have of national conservatism and nationalism, but also how does nationalism perhaps hinder some of these, or maybe in the framework of liberalism, does nationalism as a kind of liberal conception hinder some of these the prescriptions that would alleviate some of these social pathologies? Does it only further create them? And what do you think is wrong as nationalism as you understand it?
Okay, very simple point. Nationalism is liberal. It's just that simple. And it's peculiar and ahistorical and odd for a contradistinction to be opened up between conservatism and liberalism. Nationalism is liberalism to core. It defines a set of people, almost always ethnically or on the basis of language, and it defines those people against other people. It sets up a sectarianism within a state that always had people who it doesn't include, even though they claim it does. And it just as with individuals where you deny common bonds, nationalism denies both universals and common bonds. Now, I understand why there is a need for nationalism in some conservatives' minds, because they think this is the condition of solidarity. Globalism is liberal, and because globalism is liberal, we'll oppose it and we'll be national. But the trouble is nothing in the premise delivers anything nationalism promises when the meal is served. Nationalism doesn't of necessity preserve any objective goods. It often reduces them to assertion. It's akin to all the liberal denials of shared objective goods. And in addition to which, it isn't synonymous with, as the authors of the Statement of Principles claim, it isn't synonymous with the protection of national religion. It's synonymous with the destruction of religion to a national ethnic project. So I don't see anything that's claimed for nationalism as pertaining to nationalism. And on the contrary, it's the great transnational empires that have often secured minority rights. The great killing machine of Europe after the 19th century was liberal nationalism. And it's liberal nationalism that fed into all the horrors of the 20th century. So I don't see any real merit in any of the claims made for nationalism. It isn't required in order to deliver everything I've talked about, which is where I think and why I think most people are nationalists, because they can't envisage any other philosophy or any other set of axioms delivering what they want. But on the contrary, I think only universals will deliver the type of solidarity that I've spoken of. Only universals will limit imperialism. Only universals will ensure the equitable distribution of goods, and only universals will ensure the security at all levels of society. So I think nationalism is synonymous with contemporary China. Nationalism is synonymous with contemporary Russia. Nationalism is synonymous with oligopoly and plutocracy. Does it deliver the outcomes that we would wish of it? I think that in part you can base a case for nationalism on Poland and Hungary, but they only make the nationalist case because they're under the protection of empire. Empire is our current reality. It's a failure on the part of the American mind to recognize they are an empire and that they secure other nations through that. And that is a noble enterprise. That is what empires do. Empires secure difference, protect small countries from other empires, and prevent the domination of one hegemonic culture. That liberalism has taken over and captured the language of empire for itself is no reason to allow liberalism to continue to possess this language. And part of what I want to argue is that we need to recover the notion of empire or Christendom and the idea that we need to operate collectively against modern and ancient evil, because that is where we are currently, reality in geopolitics.
Philip, I understand that argument at the theoretical level. I just have a harder time kind of in practice envisioning a sort of a good empire, a virtuous empire in the West today, in large part because of the decadence of our own culture. Thinking of the European Union, for example, I know you had put them in the category of a good empire, at least vis-a-vis China or Russia, but given the drawbacks and failures of the EU, it's just a hard pill for me to swallow. So how, with an elite class that is so wedded to liberalism, a transatlantic elite class, what are the prospects then for a genuine sort of Anglo-American, broadly Western Christian empire that's actually good and stands not for liberalism, but for objective reality?
Well, look, everything that you say about the elite class applies at the national level. Just let's say you're right. Let's say everybody abandons all international obligations. Let's say America retreats to itself. Let's China eat its part of the world, Russia eats its part of the world. Let's say all of that's achieved. Well done. What would the world look like? The elite that's in power in America would still be in power. The inequalities in America would still exist. Nothing that nationalists would want to bring about would change within national borders. Quite to the contrary, what would actually happen is a new and voracious forms of empire would seek to eclipse all other nations. You don't think that the kind of Russia will stop at Ukraine. It has ambitions beyond Ukraine. I think it's Lenin who said, if you meet mush, keep pushing. And the Russians, until they met the Ukrainians, met mush. China has world historical empire ambitions. And what human history teaches us is that bad empires are only stopped by good empires. And the way to compare kind of what we have, which I agree is deficient and isn't what we want, is imagine what it would be if we didn't have it. And the European Union, for all of its faults, has caused conflict, bloodletting conflict on a grand scale between the nations of Europe to cease. It's created a form of identity that still commands the majority of the European electorate's support. All I'm saying is that the people who run those empires shouldn't be liberals, because they're causing insecurity and they're causing the type of diminution that we've talked about. But it's also very clear that liberals didn't always rule the roost. Even after the Second World War, the European Union was the creation of Catholic social teaching, if anything, arguably more than anything else. And it's that created not only the massive growth spurts that we had in the 50s and the early 60s. Italy was 7%, but the largest ever distribution of wealth and opportunity that we've seen in Europe. And in my own kind of country, we had the Christian takeover of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, and that ended worldwide slavery. It created a culture that tried to very explicitly enforce a Christian view of human beings across the globe, freed hundreds of thousands of slaves on the high seas, interdicted American slave ships, and won over time against the opposition. It wasn't a one-off. And that period, up to and including the fight with Nazi Germany, was in one sense the triumph of a British Christian empire. There's no other way to view that history. And I think the notions of, as Tom Holland, the British historian, has often pointed out, almost every ethical trope we trade on is Christian in origin. And if it wasn't for Christianity, it wouldn't exist at all. And what you have now is an erasure of all of these forms, and therefore the threat at a nationalist level of the breakup of all shared value. And believe me, that future isn't one you'd want your children to inhabit.
Our last question is, I heard that you are a collector of modern art. Would love to hear about how you started collecting it and perhaps some of your favorite works.
That's kind. My family ran an art gallery in London called Blond Fine Art when I was growing up. And we showed some of the great British artists, Paul and John Nash. I believe we also showed the first ever London exhibition of Paul Arago. But I've been collecting contemporary art for 25 years. It's one of my great passions. I'm about to open a big contemporary art gallery. So I do, I'm really doing, I'm a professor. I do public policy, and now I'm interested in the aesthetic. I'm very interested in aesthetics because, in a way, I think aesthetics is proof positive of an objective order in the universe. And I rather like the English tradition of William Morris that said everybody was an artist. I've never met a person who wasn't creative or talented at something. And perhaps like Adorno, I'm very interested in the way visual art can change human beings. It's the most generous high art. You can have no education at all, and you can go in and see kind of a work of greatness and recognize it's great. And none of the other high arts are like that. You can't really do that in classical music. You can't really do it in any other art form. So the visual is our most generous kind of gift. And really the visual, if you actually look at how archaeologists used to identify the first human settlements, people used to paint themselves. It's arguably our first art form. It's our first idea of ourselves as creative people. So I'm always interested in ways in which the visual exceeds the conceptual. And personally speaking, I've always had an intuition of the divine. And it's all, ever since I was a little boy, I first opened my eyes, I thought, well, here's proof that God exists. I mean, look at nature. It's an art form. It's a creation that suggests the creator. And I've never lost that idea. And so I find that it's a human form that can express what needs to be expressed. I think you're a totalitarian thinker if you think only one form is disclosive, because at the beginning of our conversation, all forms are disclosive. and all forms are disclosive, all other forms. And that's my great passion. I'm working on an exhibition of art and class. I want to launch the gallery with an exhibition on Brexit, because our art, especially in Europe, is now dominated by American gender politics and racial politics. But nobody ever paints class, and yet class is the biggest barrier, and it's what segregates people. And there is no art around class. There's only photography, perhaps. So that interests me. That's part of kind of the wider political project I'm interested in.
Well, thanks so much, Philip. We'll leave things there. If people want to read more from you, where can they find your work?
Well, I write a lot in articles, so I think Google's your best friend there. But you can read Red Tory. I'm writing a big book on empire, which, hopefully you'll all like. And I'm also writing a book on aesthetics. So it will be out, I think, in the next year or two. And obviously I give lots of lectures. Follow me on Twitter, _Phillip Blond. Most of it's there.
That's great. And I will also add that the next issue of the American Conservative magazine, your story is actually one of the stories listed on the cover of that magazine, which is going to be going to press this week. So you'll be able to get Philip's speech from our ISI American Economic Forum.
And it was a great pleasure to be there. And thank you to ISI continuing the project of civilizing the world. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select Modern Age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.